We chose that song not to bring you down from the sunshine, although it may well do that. Chose that song because this week, Journey of Hope is coming to town. 20 years ago, the first Journey of Hope march ever was held in Indiana. We began in Michigan City at Death Row, and with marches through Indiana, sponsored by Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation. And Glenda and I were involved in that march, and so they asked us to be involved again this year. They're coming to Bloomington tomorrow evening, right? They'll be here at the church at 7:30 for a program, and 2 members of Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation will be here to speak. And I invite you to come out for that at 7:30. Another thing that happened this week, serendipitously, and it's kind of a tragic serendipity, I think, was that a young man whom I represent as spiritual advisor and serve as spiritual advisor on federal death row lost his final appeal in the Supreme Court on Monday of this past week. And I received word from his lawyers that his cert was denied. And so this is a very personal issue for me, and it has been for several years. Before I begin about that, I want to say a little bit about solitary confinement in the United States. We have now, at the latest count that I've seen anyway, over 81,000 people in solitary confinement in this country. It's considered cruel and inhumane by many nations in the world, certainly by the Geneva Conventions. Think, if you will, where you parked your car this morning. A solitary cell at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, as well as the Indiana penitentiaries, solitary cells is just a little bit, maybe a foot wider than where you parked your car. Just a little larger than a parking space. And so consider the fact that most of the people in solitary confinement in the United States today spend at least 23 and a half hours a day in that parking space. Of course, there are 4 walls. Many of them have no windows, and that's where they spend their lives, in a parking space. We've parked them there. We've taken away the keys, and we leave them there until we want to take them out. 11,000 in California, 9,000 in Texas. In the Wabash Valley Correctional Facility, which I served as volunteer chaplain for several years, at the behest of one of my friends who happened to be teaching a GED course during his student teaching in the prison. And he had to teach through glass in the SHU, the solitary confinement ward, to this young man who was 20 years old who wanted to get his GED. And my friend Dan Combs, as many of you know in this town, asked him, "Why do you want to get a GED?" And the young man looked at him. He said, "Well, it'll take 6 months off my sentence." Dan said, "How long is your sentence?" He said, 157 years. And he was serious as a face on a gravestone. He wanted to take 6 months off. So Dan called me that week and was pretty depressed, and he said, "Bill, these guys get no contact visits from anyone. I have to teach them through glass," but he said, "In fact, you're a minister, you can get into the SHU. So I think you ought to go down there." So I decided I would go down there, and I thought, how many can there be? A few dozen? And having been in solitary confinement on 3 different occasions in my life, not by choice, but by the doors being locked. It was by choice. It was for civil disobedience and other things. But having been in solitary confinement and realizing what it did to me in a very short order, I thought, well, maybe I can go down and befriend some of these people. And when I got there, I found out there were 360 people, men in solitary confinement in that one prison in Indiana. More than 10% of the prison population was in solitary confinement. I was stunned. And so I spent my time as a volunteer chaplain going and befriending those men because I could. I was lucky. One of the things I want to say ahead of time on all this, and all the things I do, you make possible. I could not have gotten into the federal death row as a spiritual advisor without my credentials as a Unitarian Universalist minister and also as a minister in this congregation who allowed me the time to do so. So I just want to point out that this church, that's why I say this is my church. This is my church because you do things like that. You have that kind of commitment. I invite you to go to a website called Solitary Watch if you want to read more about solitary confinement and around the world. Now then, on to the mouse and the man and the murder. The man is Chad Fulks. Chad Fulks wrote me about 6.5 years ago. I received a letter from him, and he had gotten my name from another prisoner. And he wrote me and asked me to be his spiritual advisor. And he had given up his appeals and had asked for a death sentence at that time, a date of execution. And his biggest fear was not the execution. His biggest fear was going to hell. He was raised as a Pentecostal in a very poor family in West Virginia. He was abused. He was a fetal alcohol syndrome baby, which means frontal lobe damage, which means you don't know the consequence of your actions. And of course, we now know that especially men, frontal lobe doesn't really develop until you're 30 years old anyway. But his was greatly retarded, that development, because of fetal alcohol syndrome. He grew up in a very abusive home. His neighbors have testified that at the age of 6 and 7, he would sleep under the porch to hide from his father. So what I'm asking for you today is not sympathy for Chad Fulks. What I'm asking of you is empathy for Chad Fulks and people in like situations all over the place. Because as I learned more about Chad, when I finally got to meet him, and over the last 6.5 years, I realized this could be me. This could be me. I could have been born there. I could have been abused. I could have been damaged. And I could be in his shoes. And you could too. He is part of our human family. Every one of them are. So Chad grew up, by the time he was a young teenager, he was in constant trouble and in detention. Ended up on drugs, methamphetamines, was in jail, broke out with another man, and then went on a crime spree of 3 or 4 states. And I want to say up front today that what I have to say today in no way justifies their actions or exonerates them from them. Mr. Basham and Chad Fulks were both guilty of heinous crimes. And Alice Donovan and the other victim, whose name I have written down here, I'm trying to find it. There it is, Samantha Burns. Alice Donovan and Samantha Burns were murdered, and their families still suffer from that. And no amount of criminal justice action or anything else will ever bring closure to that kind of violence, that kind of tragedy. That's something people live with all their lives. But as I got to know Chad, when I first went in to see him, he had, as I said, had given up his appeals, and I wrote him back and said, I'd like for you to pick up your appeals again because it's going to take me a while to get into federal prison, and it's also going to take us a while to get to know each other. And so he did pick them up, and it took me almost 6 months to get into the prison. The chaplain at that time was very much opposed to a Unitarian Universalist coming into the prison. And he actually told Chad that Chad had the wrong spiritual advisor. He said, those people don't believe in God, they believe in crystal balls, or they have crystal balls. And I wrote the chaplain, and I said, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can see that we're going to have trouble in the future if we don't work this out. And we finally did, with the help of the head of religious services of the federal program in Washington, D.C., whom I just happened to have a contact with. And the next day I got clearance to get into the prison and began a long relationship in which Chad and I now have grown to be brothers. And it's not that anything, I think any one of you could have done the same for Chad, any one of you, if you could get in. I spend 3 hours a month, sometimes 6 hours a month with Chad over 6.5 years. But the real value in what has really happened in Chad's life doesn't come from me, it comes from Chad's discovery of himself. He tested when he was charged and arrested and before his trial. They tested his IQ with the old IQ test, that I think are crazy anyway, but he tested at 70 IQ. Had he tested at 69, it would be illegal for him to be on death row. Missed it by 1 point. I don't think it'd do any good to retest him because I think he would test much higher now because now he reads books and he's found himself in a brand new way. So, but that's the kind of persons that we have on death row all the way across this country. Are people of limited mental abilities, of absolutely no financial resources. And if you can find somebody on death row who has a lot of money, let me know about it because I have not. They just don't exist. Another story about Chad. A few months ago, he called me and he said, my grandmother wants to come see me. She's 90 years old. She still lives in her cabin in West Virginia. His grandmother, 90 years old, has never left the county she was born in. And she wanted to come to see Chad, her grandson, on death row. She climbed in the cab of a tractor trailer and rode all the way from West Virginia to visit her grandson. When she got there, they had made a mistake on the paperwork and they wouldn't let her in. And so she spent the whole day waiting, hours in the chair in the waiting room outside. And finally, the next day, they got her in to see her grandson for 3 hours. This is what we do to people when we get stuck on, regulations, paperwork, their numbers, nothing is human about it. And a 90-year-old grandmother, climbing a tractor trailer, I've done that a lot. I don't expect to do it when I'm 90. I didn't expect her to, but she did. Chad also made this little cabin for me, and serendipitously it arrived on Thursday of this week. And so I brought it, and I invite you to look at it afterwards. It's made all out of paper and a few toothpicks, because that's about all he can have in his cell. It's the second cabin he's made for me, and this one's quite good, quite detailed. I remember an old gospel song when I was back in my holiness days as a child. We used to sing this song, "Give me a cabin in the corner of glory land." When I got this, I thought, that's really all Chad wants. And I hope he gets it one of these days. In this world or the next, I hope he gets this cabin again, because it's modeled after a cabin of a friend he knew as a child. It's really all I asked for Chad. But it's a gift that he gave me. It's a wonderful thing. After about 3 years of visiting Chad, in which the first few years it was very volatile, he usually came in very, very animated. He had an awful lot of trouble with the guards and so forth. In one of our conversations one day, he came into the cell, and I could tell it had been an awful day. It had been one of those days when somebody pushed the dog off the bed, a grumpy day, a quarreling day. And Chad came in and sat down, and he was real up. And I said, "Wow, Chad, where'd you get all those buttons?" And he looks and he said, "I don't have any buttons." I said, "Yeah, you do. You got buttons all over you, and those guys out there love to push them. And every time they hit one of them, Chad Falks goes nuts. And they say, 'Wow, isn't that fun?'" I said, "You ought to turn them off. Turn them off and see what happens. It'll surprise you to death." The next month I come back to see him, and he walks in smiling. He said, "You're not going to believe it. It's been a wonderful month." He said, "I turned the buttons off." And now he gets along with everybody. And people say, "What happened to Chad? He just turned his buttons off. That's all that happened." And it got so good in his relationship with the guards and so forth, got so well, that 4 years ago, a mouse came into Chad's cell. And Chad caught it. And he emptied out one of his containers, storage containers, and he built a little nest for it and kept the mouse. A couple of days later, another mouse came in, and he said, "Oh, I'll catch that one," and he put it in there with it. Turned out they were male and female. And Chad said, I'd go back and see him. He said, "I got a whole bunch of mice." He said, I can't just flush them down the stool." So he started making little toilet paper boxes in which he'd put these mice in, the small mice, once they'd been weaned, and he'd put them in his trash, because the guards would set the trash out in the hallway for several hours before it's picked up. And he said, at least they have a chance to get away. Well, he kept Hillbilly, the one he first caught and named Hillbilly, and his mate, for 4 years. which if those of you who are in science know that mice in captivity, that's a very, very long time for a mouse. Hillbilly became so close to Chad that every morning when Chad gets up, he reads a book, which I meant to bring with me and left it on my kitchen table. It's a book of meditations that he and I have been sharing over the last 5 or 6 years. It's called The Book of Awakening by Mark Nepo, and I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful book of daily meditations. And every time when I go to see Chad, the first thing he does is bring his book and say, this is what I read this morning. But he tells me every morning I get up and I read my book of meditations, and then I empty out the cage, take all the newspaper that they've chewed up and everything, throw it away. And he's made these little round fruit containers, no metal or anything, but he has holes in them where they can breathe. And he puts his 2 mice, one in each one, and they run around his cell while he's cleaning the cage. And he's also made a wheel in the cage, in the box. And then he puts it all back together and puts the mice back in there. And he told me, he said, I put them back in there, and I looked over there a few hours later, and the mice were just sitting there looking at me. And I said, what are you doing? And then he realized he'd forgot to put their wheel back in, so he did, and then they ran around. So he's kind of the mouse man of the federal prison. The beauty of it is, because his relationship with the guards has become so solid and he's not causing any trouble, they let him keep the mice. And it's, in fact, the older guards, when a new guard comes in, they say, don't mess with Chad's mice. We know it's against the rules, but don't mess with them. Chad's mouse became a sanctuary, a friend to him. And a month before last, when I visited Chad, I walked in and Chad was grief-stricken. Hillbilly had died. And he made a little coffin for him, and he had a ceremony. He said, I didn't really know how to do this. And he said, I didn't really think it would hit me this hard. But this has been my friend for 4 years. And so he's in grieving over this mouse. This is the kind of people, and this is what is planned, that someday, in the next year perhaps, he will be let out of his cell and taken to another cell. He will be put on execution watch or suicide watch, because we don't dare let them kill themselves. And he will be strapped to the gurney and executed. And I will have to watch. Execution is an absurdity. I asked for this song to be sung because I want to be clear about Jesus. Jesus was crucified. Jesus was executed. And when we sing, when anyone sings, were you there when they crucified my Lord? We need to understand why it happened. It happened because a government condemned him to death and killed him. That's why it happened. My twin brother called me one day. He'd seen a sign on a church down here in Southern Indiana. It said, when Jesus was on the cross, you were on his mind. Yeah, right. He was thinking about Bill Breeden when he was on the cross. That doesn't make any sense. When Jesus was on the cross, he was being a witness to the brutality of the state. He was standing up for the poor, and he was crying out for justice for his people. That's why he got killed. He didn't get killed for Bill Breeden. I just don't believe that anymore. And I think accepting that execution of Jesus as some kind of beneficial, merciful act of God puts us in a violent cauldron, justifying violence from the very beginning. It's absurd. The fact is, Jesus was executed. The fact is, we have hung people from trees. We have strapped them in chairs. We have put them in gas chambers. And now we have a very humane way of doing it. We just inject them. When in fact there's no humane way to commit murder. The murder I'm talking about is a murder that should be stopped. It does not wipe out the 2 murders that Chad was involved in. It doesn't lessen that crime at all. It does nothing to bring those people back or to bring closure. It simply doesn't. That's a promise of the state, that it'll bring closure. I've met victims' families. In Michigan City, every time we've had an execution there, we've gone to Michigan City many times and stood outside to sing and pray and be a witness against the death penalty. And there was a family there that came every year. And they stood on the other side and hollered at us and were very angry because we were opposing the death penalty. And one time I thought, well, I'm going to go meet these people. And so I went to talk with them. I said, why are you here? Their daughter was murdered. They go to every execution they can. They want to witness the executions. They want to be there when people are executed. And finally, after all this, I said, I don't understand your pain. I've never had that. I hope I never do. But does it help? No, it doesn't help. Maybe someday it will, but it hasn't. It doesn't help. All it is an act of vengeance. That's all it is. I think there's a change coming. I think, in my belief, that this is a struggle that will win in my lifetime. I think the United States will join the more civilized nations of the world and outlaw executions. This past week, Chad's last appeal happened and was rejected by the Supremes, the court. And Chad wrote a note about that. And Chad wrote a letter to the Associated Press, which I just happened to find last night when I was Googling. I haven't seen Chad since this appeal was rejected. I will see him tomorrow afternoon. Chad wrote a letter to the Associated Press talking about this. He was put on death row primarily because the jury was told that he was so bad and so evil that he would not help them find the bodies of the two women. There was all circumstantial evidence the bodies had never been found. Chad actually wrote letters and drew maps and everything else of where the two women, where he saw them last. His statement is that he did not murder the women, but helped kidnap them and so forth. His co-defendant actually murdered them, according to Chad, and according to the co-defendant's confession that he gave to a sheriff, which was not allowed at the trial. Chad drew maps and so forth. They went to the wrong places and then quit searching and then said that he wouldn't help them. Chad was on death row for 7 years. Every year, the Myrtle Beach paper on the anniversary of the crime would write an article about the crime and say, Chad Folks is on death row. He still refuses to help find Alice Donovan's body. And every year, Chad would write and say, that's not true. I've been trying to help. They won't believe me. A young woman read those stories in Chad's letter and so forth, found out about it, and she wrote Chad and said, I think you're sincere. If you'll send me the maps, I'll look. She took her dogs, which is to help find bodies, trained, and she found Alice Donovan's body. The feds couldn't find it, but she did. And Chad called me in 2009 from the prison when the news broke, said, did you hear? They found Alice's body. At least they know I'm not a liar. At least they know I'm not so cruel as to not help them. And then he wrote 2 years ago, his younger brother, Chad was kind of his hero. He ended up in prison in northern Indiana from a methamphetamine bust. Chad wrote me a letter the day he was arrested and said, my brother's been arrested and it's a good thing because maybe it's the only thing that'll get him off these drugs. That night his brother committed suicide in a jail in northern Indiana. And Chad said, thinking of the pain that he felt of his brother's death made me think constantly about Alice and Samantha's family's pain, and it's driven me not to give up until they are both found. Recently, the FBI actually took Chad to West Virginia to try to find the other body. It has not been found yet. Chad says, I know no one believes me, and I can't blame them. All I want to do is help these families have their loved ones back, and I want to be clear about this. It has nothing to do with wanting to help myself. I'm in no way doing this to save my life, but rather to help these families find some kind of closure if that is possible. And he also said, the only way I will ever leave death row is the back of a hearse. So the death penalty has become very, very personal for me. What I hope is that it becomes very personal for you. I hope you never have to go there. It's hell. That was my first response to Chad on meeting him. He said, I'm afraid of going to hell. And I said, where do you think you are? This is hell. This is the worst one you're ever going to go through. And he's actually done amazing over the last few years. I've told you before that about 4 years ago, he wrote me a letter and said, for all the years that I've been on death row, it was about 7 at that time, 7 or 8 years, he said, I've always covered the mirror when they put me in the cell. They change cells every 90 days. And he said, the first thing I do is walk in and put a blanket on the mirror, and I never took it off in all these years. And he said, after our visit last week, I went in and took the blanket off the mirror, and I saw a human being instead of a monster. And that was probably the greatest gift I've ever had as a minister. Chad found himself. He found what we affirm in our first principle, the worth and dignity of every person. Chad found that. And yet, someday, if the Obama administration does as others have in the past, he will be taken out of his cell, taken down to a suicide watch cell, and then he will be strapped to a gurney and killed. Albert Camus said, to kill a man in a paroxysm of passion is understandable. To have him killed by someone else after calm and serious meditation on the pretext of duly honorably discharged is incomprehensible. This is an issue that we can win. I hope we do. I hope the solitary confinement becomes an anathema in this country. I hope that we will say, like Camus, I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice. And I hope that all of you will consider the fact that it could be you. We're really lucky, aren't we? We're really fortunate. We are the fortunate few. And I think it calls for us to be healing presence in our society. And that's what I believe about this congregation and this movement. That's what I'm about. Now, in all of that, the sun still shines today. In all of that, we don't have to walk in shadows all the time, because we can have the courage to walk together for justice. We do know that we can learn to be human beings together. We do know that we can walk sacredly upon this earth. And I hope, this song that they just sang for you, I hope that you can sing this with us too. We'll be there if they shoot him in the veins. We'll be there if they shoot him in the veins. Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. We'll be there if they shoot him in the veins. If there are not things in our lives that make us tremble, we fail to be human beings. If there are not things in our lives that make us joyful, we fail to be human beings. And I give thanks for Chad Folks, because he is a gift to me. And every time we meet each other, when we get ready to leave, he says, thanks for coming. And I say, thanks for allowing me to be here. You're a gift to my life. There are men and women in prisons throughout this country that would be a great blessing to your life. And I know we all can't be lucky like I am to be able to do this kind of thing. But we can carry them in our hearts. We can light candles in our hearts for them. And they will cause us to walk more sacredly upon the earth. I truly believe that. Join with us in singing, Stand in Body and or Spirit. Let us sing our closing hymn, number 190, Light of Ages and of Nations.